Nadia Nagamootoo, welcome to the lockdown sessions. How are you?
Thank you, Brad. Yeah, I'm good. I'm very well, thank you. A little bit on the tired side. Just, about 2 weeks off of giving birth. So
you're looking fabulous for someone who's 8.5 months pregnant.
Thank you.
All I can say. So look, we were just joking offline as we talked about all the ways we could describe you, but how I met you was as the founder and CEO of Avenir Consulting, and focusing explicitly with corporate clients around D&I and talking and working with people around gender, inclusion, and care. Of course, you're a chartered psychologist as well, and you and I have worked together on executive coaching programs. In fact, I think the first time we met, we were pitching an ILM program where we met outside a car park somewhere in Essex.
Is that the only time we've met face to face?
Yeah, right. It was the only time we met face to face.
Yeah.
And I just remember us trying to find the office and walking around from the car park. But there was this instant connection, and we've always had lovely conversations. And I wanted you to come on here because I always learn something when we talk, and often around this topic, around D&I. And it's great to have an expert. So you're also an expert podcaster, by the way. We should put that out there as well. Do a little shameless plug of your own podcast. But what I would love to hear from you today, and I start all of the sessions in the same way, is to find out a little bit about your passions and what you're really focusing on with clients these days. But as a starter for 10, what have you observed? You know, we're in lockdown 2. There's been months of this. Fatigue is definitely setting in, right? So what have your observations been around people, behavior, the way we're kind of operating over the last 8 months? What have you seen?
It's been fascinating. You know, as a psychologist, I must admit, I, with my professional hat on, I just find it absolutely fascinating, the behavioural shifts that we're seeing. So if you think about, just on the approach to the first lockdown, so the month of March, let's just say, how the shelves were empty, that panic buying stage, and sheer, and I reflected on this, and I put out a few videos at the beginning of lockdown, and I reflected on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is like a classic, framework, psychology framework.
Year 1, around, uni.
The basic fundamental need people were feeling from a safety perspective, that fundamental need had not been met or wasn't being met in March, and from a safety, a physiological safety, obviously, for those who are more vulnerable, it's maintained over the 8 months of feeling like your basic human need of physiological safety. I'm not safe to step out of the house. That's a long, prolonged period of time. And so I think this second lockdown has taken its toll, particularly for that group of people, where it just feels like will this ever end? And I think that glimmer of hope of a potential vaccine that's being spoken about now is potentially keeping some going. Obviously, we've seen mental health decline as a result. So that's been really tough, I think. For others, say, for example, for myself, my family, our daughter was off school for 2 months, but she was one in the year group because she's in the younger years. The government prioritized her going back, so then she was back before this, like for the last half term, and she's gone back to school. And I think because we're in the lower risk category, as we're healthy, we're from the age group, that's from those sorts of criteria. We haven't obviously carried on as usual. We're being very careful. And I think so there's a large proportion of people where behaviourally, at the beginning of lockdown, were really cautious and maybe wiping down their food when they went to and all of that, and doing all of the stuff that we were being told to do to be careful. But as it's gone on and through the second lockdown, it's almost like, well, we're not going to there's nothing really to change anymore because we've made the big change in our lifestyle. I don't feel as vulnerable. We're kind of living with it, and I've lived through it, and either I've caught it already or I haven't caught it yet. And so I think from a human psychological perspective, there's something around for the people in the lower vulnerability category of, look, it is what it is. We have to live our lives. Our children have to go to school. They're mixing with other families and kids. How much can we really isolate and protect ourselves other than doing the sensible things, wearing the mask, keeping our distance, But I certainly don't hesitate to go if I need to get something from the supermarket. I wouldn't think, that's a high risk for me. So it's affected different people in different ways. It's fascinating, to be honest.
How quickly do people become institutionalized, though? Because this is one of my concerns for those maybe that are more vulnerable or perceive themselves as more vulnerable.
So, yeah, habits grow quite quickly, actually. They do. And I've found it, even, and I'm not in the vulnerable, as I said, category, but even I've found it when, if I've gone to the supermarket, for example, and I'm looking into the fridge or freezer section, and someone just comes just that little bit too close to me in their endeavor to get whatever out of the fridge or freezer, and I will kind of recoil a bit, I'll kind of pull back going, okay, this is closer than this 1 meter with masks on that I'm, or I'll look with judgment if someone's walking around without a mask, right? Like properly, like I'll be like, who do you think you are? Walking around without a mask.
I complained in my local shop when there were a bunch of kids in there without wearing masks, and I said to the shop owner, listen, this isn't fair for the old
Totally.
people who won't want to come in, But this institutionalization they form quickly, but they die slowly.
Yes. Yeah, I think it will take time once we have a vaccine and it's being rolled out for people to trust the vaccine. Because obviously we've heard different statistics depending on if it's the Oxford vaccine or we've heard different rates of how successful it is. So there'll be some caution still, and I think it will take some time to feel comfortable having lots of people in our house and to walk into a shop without a mask on, and not be constantly thinking of, I pick up my post, I have to wash my hands, or these habits, because it's been drilled into us. That's what campaigning does, that's what propaganda does, and that's exactly what's really through a marketing campaign, and they're pushing the behavioural change. This is behavioural economics, really, but it's fascinating how they've managed to very quickly get us into, washing our hands thoroughly, how to, that it's been really interesting.
But it's also created for some, it was done so successfully at the beginning. I think this is part of the challenge now. It was hammered home, actually, I think from a fear perspective.
Yes.
We were so frightened.
We were, yeah.
The bubonic plague, take 2, and actually the pragmatic, phlegmatic guy that I am says, it's hideous, this virus. I do not want to get it. I may have had it in March, but when I did an antibodies test in July, I didn't show antibodies. I was part of the NHS sort of random selection.
Okay.
Did the antibodies test, didn't have it. Have done COVID tests because of being at risk in certain situations, but again, touch wood, didn't have it. And I wouldn't want it. But, and maybe this kind of leads us, is like a bridge into some of the work that you do, because it seems to me as though this virus is a little judgmental itself. It's quite racist as a virus. It seems classist as a virus. It does not understand D&I for sure.
Yeah, it definitely needs some training.
Right. Because when you look at those that have fallen ill, and then you look at those that get really sick, actually, there is now data that says, it's 0.05% of the population. And when you look at the amount of children, so I saw a data point last week of children under 12 who had passed away in this country from COVID. All of them, bar I think 4 or 5, had serious underlying conditions.
Right.
But more people had died of drowning last year in the UK under 12 than had died from COVID. Would we shut all the schools and stop children from ever swimming again? Probably not. So you do a lot of work around inclusion.
I do.
With a virus like this that affects certain parts of the community, does it start to have an impact on the way in which we even engage with other parts of communities? So I'm thinking from a community perspective first, before we maybe look at the corporate world. Are we being less inclusive now because of what's happened, and perhaps retreating more into our own little worlds, our own bubbles, to use the language of the time? I don't know. A genuine, interesting question.
It's a really fascinating question, actually. The way you framed it, I hadn't actually considered the impact of those statistics of ethnic minority people catching COVID more, being more vulnerable to it, and also from a class perspective as well. I hadn't necessarily considered the impact on how systemically that might impact how those people are viewed, but also how they're engaged with the wider majority community. I think that people, it's really interesting, but I don't know whether people are in this headspace at the moment so if you sit in the majority group, so you're white and from a class perspective you don't fall into the sort of the lower socioeconomic category. I think people are quite insular at the moment, so I genuinely don't think at the moment they're necessarily considering how they're engaging, or if they're engaging in a different way with that particular community that are more vulnerable. I think that every family and every person is thinking quite very much about themselves and about their immediates. And if their immediates are then their normal circle, based on the assumption that we tend to associate with people like us. So their immediate sphere of people who they tend to engage with might not necessarily be those people in the vulnerable category. I don't know whether they would necessarily, there's no reason why they would then start to consider how they would engage with that group in a different way, unless they pass them on the street. It's too transient how they would then connect with that community. So I don't think people are thinking about it yet, but it might come about later, once bubbles start, once we start hopefully meeting up again and engaging with different groups again.
I don't know. I can't even remember what that's like. I've done one workshop on site since March the 9th. And that was with a pharma company where we were in PPE gear. They're actually creating plasma therapeutics and trying to help with the COVID situation. But we were PPE'd up. And so it felt very safe.
Right.
Running a workshop in a full mask with rubber gloves, latex gloves, very strange experience. But I've done it. I wouldn't want to do it again. I even asked the chairperson and said to him, "Listen, are you sure you want to do this tomorrow? Shall we just do this on Zoom where we can at least see each other?" "No, I want everyone together." "Okay, no problem." But this idea, okay, so I'm hearing what you're saying. Perhaps we haven't got to the point where we're actually judging. What about in corporate? So you work a lot in this D&I space, and clearly, globally actually, but clearly in this country, we're not great at this. You know, I was speaking to a VP of HR for TES, Time Educational Supplement. She was saying, you know, to me, you know, we're trying, we're moving towards it, but do we have enough women? Do we have enough people of color? Do we have enough gender fluidity from a heterosexual, bisexual, gay, trans? We are not fully represented from a D&I perspective across any board, unless you're in that very sort of nuanced field where actually if you're running a business and you happen to be an entrepreneur and you're trans and identifying in that world, then of course the community around you will be driving your business. And then you probably don't have a 50-year-old white middle-aged guy on your board either, right?
Right.
So how are businesses coping with this topic right now when they're worried about strategy and they're worried about they can't plan for 3 months, and then there's you talking about, well, come on guys, let's talk about gender inclusion.
Yes. So I think that organizations this year, well, for the majority, not all, some have sort of managed to sustain their business and in fact grown their business this year, but a lot of businesses are have been massively impacted, either been shut down, had to furlough staff, had to make redundancies. And so, of course, it's really challenging then to have a conversation when they're thinking about financial bottom line, their future for 2021, what that might look like, to start having this conversation around diversity and inclusion. I think what, obviously, as we know, what happened in May with Black Lives Matter, George Floyd and the movement that followed, it wasn't a coincidence that it happened this year. I think that there's something, again, psychological that happens within a society when things build up. So there was already a lot of stress, there was already a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear that built up because of COVID. And born out of that, you see extreme behaviours, and people's biases and discrimination and the practices come out when people are feeling vulnerable, when they're feeling they're not safe, when they're feeling, you know, everything like they're being attacked.
Right.
So Black Lives Matter was fascinating from that psychological perspective of why this year, why 2020 did this happen. And I think that as a result of that, going back to your question around organizational focus on diversity and inclusion, that many have been forced, for want of a better word, to really shine a light on their own organization and recognize the impact that COVID has had on their people, but also that particularly, the minority, from a racial perspective, the minority group have been impacted and facing for, well, centuries, but ever since, and that's been really, really challenging for organizations, that balance between, we're in the middle of trying to figure out how we're going to survive, but actually we can't survive if our people are, because what Black Lives Matter did was allow this platform of a conversation, a dialogue that's always been sort of either pushed away or set aside, or going, well, I live with this on a daily basis, so what's the point in voicing this? And very similar to sort of a hashtag Me Too movement, with the sort of, this is unreal what's happened, in the States, but actually this happens not to this extent of, all of the killings that's happened in there. But for me personally, I get discriminated against. I get, various biases that play out, and comments and different, on a daily basis, and I've witnessed, you know, racial discrimination and, you know, this. So that inevitably, with the background of COVID and the emotions already and the fear and all of those emotions running, to allow people to go, yes, this, we need to talk about this. This is, and it's not just in the States. It is here, right here on our doorstep, in this country, in this region of the country, in this organization, and I need you to hear it. That's been.
But it goes, doesn't it? It goes back to your point around safety as well, because psychological safety is so important. It's going to be even more important as we approach back into work, you know, tubing it, training it, traveling in. And this whole concept of racial equality or inequality, in fact, if it doesn't get discussed, you're just creating another lane of psychological unsafety. And you know, I was born into a Jewish family. Clearly, my name is Solomon, so you know, I'm Jewish, and I was subjected to anti-Semitism from my first day at secondary school. I was at a secular primary school, and even in my 30s and 40s, when I'm on the terraces of my beloved football club, when Tottenham Hotspur would come along, you know, their nickname is the horrible word for Jews. And the guys who I would sit with, Nadia, for 20 years would sing the most disgusting, foul-mouthed songs about Jews with every swear word you could imagine. And then, check this, they lean forward, tap me on the shoulder and go, not you, Brad, obviously. Oh, that's okay, guys.
Crack on with it then, if it's not me.
Sing it again.
Gosh, yeah, yes.
So,
it's so ingrained. They're not necessarily even thinking about what they're singing.
Right. So to that point, how do you move an organization that aren't even recognizing, you know, when was the last time they looked around their board and looked for people of color or any kind of gender balance? I mean, we talk about women a lot, right? Women in leadership, women breaking glass ceilings, etc., etc. We run leadership programs for women.
Yeah.
Female leadership programs run by women for women. But we don't see leadership programs for people of color.
No. Run
by people of. How do we build not just awareness, but movement and momentum? Because the BLM movement, it struggled a little bit, I think, in my eyes, because of the political connotations attached to it as a party and raising all these funds and the defunding of the police that was growing out of the US. And it started to get a little bit of bad press. Kind of like most things, like the Me Too, you know, it's a hashtag for a while, and then people's Instagram feeds pick up something else. So how do you get corporates to genuinely believe that some form of both race and gender inclusion and equality should be on their agendas?
Yeah. So I prefer not to sort of just focus on gender and race, whilst I know that they are on the, for many organizations, one, you know, the top two kind of on the priority list, and start from a position of just discussing what are we talking about, this language that we're using. What does the term diversity mean? What does the term inclusion mean? Because we tend to wrap up inclusion and diversity, or diversity and inclusion, as if they mean the same thing, and they don't. They don't mean the same thing, and they are two very distinct concepts, as is belonging, as is privilege, as is equality versus equity. You know, all of these concepts that actually we band about, but actually do we really understand what it is that we're talking about? Because unless you get this fundamental, the language, the foundational kind of, well, this is what we're talking about, and this is why it's important to our people. This is why it's important for, you know, our organization, the general health and well-being of our organization, and connect that to, well, if you have a sick organization, for want of a better word, as in the people aren't performing because they don't feel accepted for who they are. They're constantly covering their identities and trying to fit in. They're not expressing themselves in the way that is truly their authentic selves. They'll feel judged if they open their mouths and voice their true opinion. All of these things, which we know plays out in an organization where the dominant groups, so the majority groups, are allowed and left to just do their thing. Not in a, you're in the dominant group, shame on you for, but actually raising their awareness of, oh my gosh, actually I do sit in the dominant group for many of these characteristics. And I never really thought how someone who might not sit in this group with me might their experience would be different to mine. I've always thought that everyone's experience was exactly the same as mine. So it's I think it's really important with the framing of this around, we start with a general understanding of what we're talking about, and also ensure that people don't feel like we're making them to feel guilty or ashamed of who they are, the background, the life that they've led. It's people, if people have been born into a higher social class, or they've been born into a white family, or they're a male, or we can't turn around and criticize them for it, and we can't also expect them to have already the self-awareness about the impact that their natural characteristics would have had on their life, the privilege that they would have had. However, what organizations, and the starting point for organizations around this is very much around the self-awareness for everyone in the organization, and for the organization itself to recognize what's the power system, what's in this particular organization, where does the power lie, and whose responsibility is it to shift that power dynamic. So I don't know if that's answered your question.
Yeah, well, I like the idea of the power dynamic, because I think as soon as you ask that question, a lot of the time you will find yourself with white, middle-aged males. It's probably where a lot of the power dynamic lies. I've always been amazed that there isn't one official out professional footballer. It just does not resonate for me. It is impossible that in 92 professional clubs with 25 guys in these clubs, in the female world of football, they're totally comfortable being out. In cricket, you've got people celebrating marriages in the same, in the England team, in the England women's football team, you've got women celebrating that they're gay. You've got one of the most profoundly gifted female American footballers, double Olympic champion, World Cup winner, and she's openly talking about her world that she lives in. But in the male world of professional football, there isn't one professionally out player. Now, that's just not realistic, right? What world are we all living in where we think that's vaguely a reflect? And yet, look at the powers that be. Look at where that power base is. Who are the fans? Who runs the Football Association? The only people that run the Football Association are 60-year-old white men of privilege who probably grew up in a world where being out wasn't acceptable.
Yes.
And they are themselves finding themselves even in the closet because they can't. But imagine a world where, these guys are being paid millions of pounds a year to be these icons, and they cannot be their authentic self.
Exactly.
On a micro level, you take that back into a corporate. You mentioned two words earlier. You talked about the difference between equality and equity. Just give me a bit more about that, because I understand diversity and inclusion and how they are different and yet connected. What's this equality versus equity piece?
Yeah, so we always talk about gender equality or racial equality, And the distinction is, for me, very clear, and I'm very much focus my work on the equity side as opposed to creating equality. And the reason for this is that when you're talking about equality, you're very much saying that everyone deserves the same treatment, that we should be, that fairness comes from treating everyone the same. Okay. And so and this very much links to our fundamental belief that we want to believe, particularly in our society, that meritocracy exists. That if you've got 5 people going for a job, the best person for that job, the right person will get the job. Okay, they were all treated exactly the same. We even did sort of, CVs where we didn't see their names or their ages, or so it was all done very fairly, and we got a very diverse group of people to have a structured interview with them. So you can kind of go, yes, this was as fair as this process could be. We were treated very equally. The best person got the job. Now, the issue with that is that it doesn't take into account the structural advantage that certain groups of people have in the system. Yeah. If the system has been designed, and I'm talking about at a societal level, the system has been designed by the dominant, the majority group, then certain privileges would have been gained by certain people. That means that by the time they get to that interview for that job, some will have had to have worked harder to get there compared to others. Okay, that's just how structurally our system works. Some would have had sponsors or a support network. They would have known someone who knew someone who allowed them to have this door opened to get them into this interview, or just simple things that, in terms of things that play out for people of a Black or ethnic minority background, where the biases that play out just simply by having the color of skin that they have means that they're going to be overlooked for certain things. So there's something around the system that means that actually we're not all starting from the same position. So if we're not starting from the same position, but then we treat everyone the same in a job interview process, for example, then actually, is that really fair? So what equity does is acknowledge as much as possible the structural advantage and the privilege that plays out in society, to account for that. So as a really like an analogy to this, and I use this in some of my workshops, is that if you imagine the London Underground, I know you've been there, but a lot of people go down the London Underground using the escalators or the stairs. Okay, that's how you get from street level to platform level. Okay, no one is stopping particular groups of people from using the stairs or the escalator. Everyone has equality. Everyone has a fair opportunity to use the stairs and the escalator. However, there are some people who will just not be able to get from street level to platform level despite the stairs and the escalator, because they've got some form of disability. They might have a buggy with them. They have some reason why they can't use the stairs or the escalator. So equality would just be offering the stairs and the escalator. Equity would be acknowledging that in order to make it fair, you have to install a lift, and then that would allow everyone equity to get to the platform level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. It's interesting, isn't it? Because on so much of this, when the BLM movement was really taking hold, I remember watching some stuff. I'm really interested in American politics, so I follow different news channels. There was a show on CNN that was actually looking at what were the SAT results required by Black, white, and Hispanic people to join the police force. and they would load the SAT results requirements of certain racial groups in order. So if I'm black and I'm trying to become a police officer in LA, in California, I would need 25 points higher than a white guy going for the same job on my SATs. I would need a higher point grade average or grade point average in order to get there. So your idea of it's equal, we can all go for it, but there's no equity there, right? At all.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And sometimes it's really hard to measure. So the reason why we get backlash in organizations is, so in my example of the London Underground, no one's going to turn around and go, well, that's really unfair now, you've installed a lift. Because people can see that it isn't fair for some people because they do have a disadvantage, then aren't able to use the escalators or the stairs. If you take that into the context of an organization and in the context of getting a job, so there's 5 people going for a job, how do you take into account the structural advantage that some people would have had in that? But it's not, you can't measure it. It's not like we're talking about people's heights, this person's taller and so they've got like a 6 centimeter advantage over this person. We're talking about things that are quite very intangible, hidden, things that have affected their lives, that, doors that have opened and been closed for someone else. How do you take that? And so that's where we get the backlash for positive action programs. So you were talking about the leadership programs at CTG that you run around women only, trying to support them, get them through the organization, support them to excel and get higher. Well, I, all the time, have at least one male in my workshop who just believes that that's unfair. It isn't equality at all. It isn't, because for them, there isn't a male program. There isn't a male only program. So how is that? That's reverse discrimination is sometimes what I hear.
And I can think back even to, when I was going for secondary school exams, there were schools that, I grew up in North London, and there were schools that actually had what was termed Jewish quotas.
Okay.
So schools would take 10 Jewish boys per year. Wow, really? We're only going back 40 years, by the way.
Yeah.
That's
unreal, isn't it?
Right?
Unreal.
One generation. So I know and trust it gets better, but then of course positive discrimination takes on a slightly different angle and irritates others. I read an article, it was on old data, but in just thinking about this conversation with you, that now the most underrepresented group of people at universities in the UK are white working class guys.
That's right. Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah.
So what happens to this privilege of, being born white, whatever class system you're grown into? White seems to be the class of at least an element of privilege of some sort, right? But now that's completely turned around, and they're the most underrepresented group of people going to university.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's completely turned around. I think educational achievement and is one aspect of privilege. Simply what we're saying when we're talking about racial advantage is that simply having the coloured skin, regardless of your social class, regardless of your educational attainment, regardless of anything else, that you would have been afforded certain advantages just simply, and it's really hard to articulate, because what the reason why is because we're talking about an absence of something,
right?
So how do you know what it is that you haven't ever had to do or been affected by? How do you know that the absence of someone following you around a shop because they think you're about to shoplift? If it's never happened to you, you won't know that other people of a different ethnic background will have experienced that. Or someone, if as you walk by, holding their handbag a bit closer to them, and noticing that because of fear that you might take it off them. If you've never ever crossed your, or even just, is this country okay for me to go on holiday to? The absence of that, you never questioned whether it's okay to go to this part of the UK because of the, and yet, certainly when I was visiting Wales, North Wales, I think I went to, and I absolutely stuck out like a sore thumb. Honestly, I was in the minority of one, basically, as I visited, and funny enough, I was a lot younger actually, so it didn't ever occur to me because I'm London based. I've always been in a very diverse community.
Diverse.
So my friends and I decided, this was at the age of 18 or 19, let's go and rent a cottage and go for some nice walk.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just did, but yet when I arrived and I looked around, I felt like, no one said, it wasn't like I was being discriminated, but it was just a feeling of being in the minority and being different. So, and it's hard to articulate that to someone of a white background who just would never have ever occurred to them in their life.
I still remember in my first year at uni being the first Jewish person that people had ever met or interacted with. I am the only Jewish person in my entire village. And even 5 years ago, I would hear anti-Semitic comments on the sidelines of football matches when I, be walking my dog on a Saturday, as though it was funny.
Yeah.
As though it was funny. And I don't look particularly Semitic. My features aren't necessarily that Semitic where people would think I was.
Right.
And I used to walk around, with a skinhead haircut and, the clothes I wore. Old women would clutch their handbags when I walked past them, or they would cross the road. And in a way, it's almost like it's wow, okay, I got to look in the mirror. I'm wondering, from an organizational point of view, are we genuinely ready to embrace the multi-layers of personal expression that we encourage, but do we want it in our businesses?
Fascinating, isn't it? Because in order to move forward, and if we're saying we're embracing diversity and inclusion, and we are, forward thinking in this, and then all of those biases, those stereotypes of what it means to be professional, what it means to look professional, how we work in this organization, how do you maintain the company or the organizational identity, and this is who we are, and a sense of belonging and fit, because people want that sense of belonging, but yet introduce the diversity and ensure that everyone can express themselves. So this is the golden question, and this is what we're all working towards. It has to start with recognizing our biases, and being able to have that curiosity and that open-mindedness, that actually doing business in a different way, or representing our business through people who look maybe different to how we might typically in the past be recruiting people in, or look like ourselves, that's going to benefit our organization, and that our customers or our client base or our market will still come to us and use us and take us seriously. There's all of this fear around, but if we bring someone in who's dressed like this, or is transgender, or there's a fear around it, because how will it impact our business? What we're trying to do, certainly at Avenir and anyone working in the D&I space, is to say, will it impact your business? Yes. It will transform your business? Yes. But trust me, it's the only way that your organization will achieve any form of sustainability in the next 5 to 10 years.
And that's about being able to see how I want to move forward. You just reminded me, I used to coach women's football. And I took a GB team out to a Maccabea Games back in 2009, and I took a transgender, male to female, gender reassignment surgery had taken place 4 years before, so lived 7 years as a woman. And this individual had actually represented a male version of the team when they were a teenage boy. So the courage they had in coming along, right? In this competition, we had to work so hard to enable her to play. Blood tests, urine samples, to prove her levels of testosterone were lower than some of the other women actually playing in the teams, right? But because visually she was 1.88 m, so very tall, still broad and muscular, so male determined features. The backlash, the protection, and of course all that made our team do was protect her even more, right? And she was a brilliant footballer, by the way. Was protect her more, and actually she ended up with a suspected broken rib. I had to take her to the hospital. This was in the Middle East,
right?
So you can imagine
there
the lack of openness to trans was massive. And honestly, we both didn't feel safe in the hospital. And that lack of, you said the word curiosity, and I suppose I'm wondering, with both race, this sort of structural privilege, we're a long way off, Nadia, from even being close to the beginning of the journey. It feels to me. Maybe that's my own structural privilege coming out, because I've only ever suffered racism from an anti-Semitic perspective.
You never say only. I mean, that's valid for you. It's valid for, it's absolutely, it's everyone should be able to feel like they can share that lived experience of one aspect of their life, 2 aspects, 3, 4, however many aspects of their identity that they feel puts them in a position of being in the minority and feeling like they aren't as accepted or supported to be their true selves. So for me, that's important to make that point. But we are no, I'm conscious not to end on a downer, really, in terms of we're really far from getting there. But we have come a long way. The challenge we have in society, if you think about from a historical perspective, is that we introduce new diversity characteristics in terms of how our society is evolving. So if you think to when we were growing up, so 70s, 80s, people weren't talking about gender fluidity. Okay. And so just thinking now about being a parent in 2020, it's hugely at the forefront of our minds that as soon as our children get to a certain age, 9, 10, 11, into secondary school, that is absolutely the language and the environment that they're in. They will be talking about it. They will be exploring, trying to figure out their gender identity. That is something for people of our generation as parents to try and get this requires a huge amount of open-mindedness and curiosity from our perspective.
Yes.
Right.
And I think we are a generation of open-minded people. The 70s and 80s are our gen. When we were kids growing up, you were a tomboy. That was the only words we had for it, right? I mean, talk about limitation. Oh, she's a tomboy. No, we wouldn't be able to get away with that. But a dear friend of mine is already exploring this with their own kids. And I think if we are open, or maybe this is the positive note, if we are open, and soon to be again mum for the second time, your family is growing, I have no doubt you'll be bringing your kids up to be generous with how they acknowledge and accept all forms that fall in front of them.
They possibly can.
Right. And maybe because you've experienced so many different layers yourself through your life, maybe you're more acutely tuned in to it. If there's one thing, so to really leave on a positive, if there's one thing as CEOs, as C-suites, leaders could do, because a number of leaders listen to this podcast, so we have a little audience. If there was something that they could do that would positively move them and their businesses forward in appreciating and engaging with the diversity and inclusion concept, what could you recommend to them to start at least thinking on?
So for me, if these chief executives, these leaders haven't themselves been through a journey of understanding some of those fundamental concepts that we were talking about just earlier, and starting to raise their own self-awareness and going on their own journey about their life experiences, how that might have been different to someone sitting next to them, and recognizing and starting to look around and going, actually, I have had some privileges. That doesn't mean that I've led a privileged life. We're not saying that, but there are some privileges that have been afforded to me because of certain characteristics that I hold. And I recognize that. I recognize that there are certain people who won't have had those advantages. And actually, this is about self-awareness raising. So there's basically what I'm saying is work on yourself first.
Yeah.
Get yourself in the understanding. There's podcasts out there. There's books out there, unbelievable number of books. There's brilliant TED Talks on this subject. Start having the conversations between you and just understanding, well, what are we talking about here? And how do I personally, as a senior leader in this organization, play a role in the power systems and the structural advantage that plays out for certain people in this organization? And once you understand that, then there's an accountability and a sense of, I hope, ownership to start shifting that power system. And it has to start with opening up a dialogue within your organization and really, really being open-minded and curious about some of these experiences that people will have had in your organization that might be very painful to hear and uncomfortable to hear, that in my organization I have people who have experienced this. That's not going to sit well, but it's so important to hear it.
We've got to hear the story, and my hope to add to that is, as the demographic changes in our organization, yes, we're multi-generational, but actually as those multi-generation sort of data points start to move and shift, and we've got a larger percentage of younger people coming through organizations, so the need for expression gets higher and higher. We're not so uptight anymore, my generation and above, a little bit wound tight in sharing. I think that helps and enables. So a lot of the startups are very fluid and open around this stuff, and the more sort of established organizations are the ones that struggle a bit more. And I think we'll shamelessly plug your podcast when we send out the notes on this one.
Thank you.
Because it's all about this topic, which I find fascinating. I'm a complete novice on, I said to you before, I sometimes get nervous even in posing questions because I'm not sure if they even sound appropriate. But I want to thank you for just shining a little light for this topic, which is a minefield for everyone, but so important that if we don't cross it, when you do cross a minefield, there are some explosions. Some people do hit the wrong button, you've got to do it. And without it, all we end up being is in denial. And actually, that's really unhealthy.
Exactly.
For all of us. Nadia, listen, you're going off in a couple of weeks' time to push one out. So you've got Bobby.
So delicately put.
Yes. We wish you safe arrivals.
Thank you. Thank you.
And a wonderful, peaceful, festive time with the rest of your family. And you and I will connect in the new year, no doubt.
Oh, yeah.
I will expect a picture at
yes.
before the end of this year of Bobby Nagamootoo.
Oh, thank you so much, Brad. Thank you for having me on your show. And I will look forward to connecting again.
Brilliant. I think that's a wrap. Well done, you. Thank you, Nadia. See you soon.
See you.